You are in 13th century England, in the year 1287, experiencing life as a weary traveller seeking shelter at a roadside inn. The stone floor is cold against your mud-caked boots, and the acrid smell of wood smoke mingles with something far more intriguing, a rich, complex aroma that seems to have absorbed decades of stories within its steam. Imagine waking up in a place where hunger is not just discomfort but a constant companion, where the next meal might be your last, and where a single pot of soup could hold secrets that would change everything you thought you knew about survival. The perpetual soup inn stood like a weathered sentinel beside the muddy road that connected London to the northern villages. Its timber walls had witnessed more secrets than any confessional, and its proprietress, Margot Ashford, had stirred the same pot for over 15 years. But tonight, something was terribly wrong. Another bowl, good sir? Margot asked, her weathered hands trembling slightly as she ladled the steaming broth. The traveller before her, a merchant by his fine wool cloak, nodded eagerly, unaware that he might be consuming his final meal. The perpetual soup was legendary among travellers. It had been cooking continuously since Margot inherited the inn from her late husband, and locals swore it grew more delicious with each passing year. Vegetables, herbs, scraps of meat, and whatever bounty the seasons provided were added daily to the great iron cauldron that never left the fire. The soup evolved, transformed, but never ended. "Tell me, mistress," the merchant said between hungry spoonfuls, "what makes this broth so extraordinary? I have travelled from Paris to Prague, yet never tasted anything quite like this." Margot forced a smile, though her eyes darted nervously toward the kitchen. "Time, good sir. Time and the stories of every soul who has passed through these doors." She paused, watching him consume another spoonful. Each ingredient carries the essence of those who came before. What the merchant did not know, what no one knew except Margot herself, was that someone had been tampering with her precious soup. 3 days ago, she had discovered strange bitter herbs floating near the surface, herbs she had never added. Then yesterday, a guest had fallen violently ill after eating, though he had recovered by morning. The incident had shaken her more than she cared to admit. "The soup tastes different tonight," observed Elias Blackthorne, a knight who had become a regular visitor. He sat in the corner, his velvet-lined armor catching the firelight. Despite his noble bearing, there was something unsettling about him, the way his eyes seemed to pierce through shadows, the manner in which he appeared to listen to conversations that had not yet begun. "Different how, Sir Elias?" Margot asked, though she already suspected the answer. The knight had an uncanny ability to detect even the slightest changes in flavor, as if he possessed senses sharpened by some supernatural force. "Darker," he replied, his voice carrying an edge that made the other patrons unconsciously lean away, as if shadows themselves had been stirred into the pot. Margot felt her blood chill. She had noticed the same thing, but had hoped it was merely her imagination. The soup had indeed grown darker over the past week, and its aroma had acquired an almost metallic undertone that reminded her unpleasantly of blood. "Perhaps it is merely the new batch of herbs I purchased from the forest dwellers," she lied, though her voice lacked conviction. Sir Elias studied her with those penetrating eyes. "Or perhaps," he said slowly, "someone wishes to poison more than just the soup." He stood, his armor creating a symphony of metallic whispers. "I shall investigate this matter personally, Mistress Ashford. No one threatens what belongs under my protection." As he moved toward the door, Margot called after him, "Sir Elias, what do you mean by what belongs under your protection?" He paused, his hand on the wooden handle. "This inn, mistress, this soup, and everyone who depends upon it for survival." His smile was both reassuring and terrifying. "I have been watching over this place far longer than you might imagine." The door closed behind him with a resounding thud, leaving Margot alone with her fears and her eternally cooking pot. She approached the cauldron, peering into its dark depths. The surface reflected her worried face, but for just a moment. She could have sworn she saw something else, a pair of eyes staring back at her from within the soup itself. Outside, the wind howled through the bare branches of winter trees, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf called to its pack. Margot shivered, not from cold, but from the growing certainty that her perpetual soup had become something far more dangerous than a simple meal. It had become a weapon, and she was about to discover that in medieval times, even the most innocent traditions could hide the deadliest secrets. The merchant finished his bowl and requested another, completely unaware that each spoonful might be drawing him deeper into a mystery that had been brewing for much longer than 15 years. For in the darkness beyond the inn's walls, someone was indeed watching, waiting, and planning the next move in a game where the stakes were higher than anyone could imagine. The night's vigil between dreams, you were now experiencing the strange world of medieval sleep patterns, where the night was divided into two distinct periods of rest, and the hours between them belonged to those who dared to venture into the realm of waking dreams. The clock tower of the village church had just chimed midnight when Sir Elias Blackthorne completed his first sleep. This was not unusual throughout medieval Europe. People naturally divided their slumber into two segments, awakening after 3 or 4 hours to spend time in prayer, conversation, or quiet contemplation before returning to bed until dawn. But Elias was not like other people. During these midnight hours, he experienced visions that seemed to blur the line between prophecy and nightmare. Tonight, as he sat in his chamber writing verses by candlelight, the quill trembled in his hand. The words flowing onto the parchment were not his own. They came from somewhere deeper, darker, as if dictated by voices only he could hear. "The soup that never ends shall be the vessel of ending," he wrote, though he had no conscious memory of forming the thought. When the perpetual becomes poison, the guardian must choose between salvation and damnation. The velvet lining of his armor rustled as he shifted uncomfortably. This luxury was technically forbidden. Only barons and higher nobility had the legal right to wear velvet, and Elias held no such title. Yet he had worn it for so long that he could no longer remember when or why he had first donned the forbidden fabric. It had become part of him, like his skin or his bones. A soft knock interrupted his midnight musings. "Enter," he called, though he already knew who would appear. Gwyneth Hartwell stepped into the chamber, her wheat-coloured hair braided with protective herbs, and her arms carrying a bouquet of garlic and sage. She was to be married in 3 days to a man she had never chosen. Yet her presence in Elias's room at this forbidden hour suggested that her heart had already made a different choice. "I cannot sleep," she whispered, closing the door behind her. "Every time I close my eyes, I see him, my betrothed. He seems to grow more monstrous with each passing hour." Elias set down his quill and turned to face her. "Your dreams speak truly, Gwyneth. The man your father has chosen is not what he appears to be. How can you know this? You have never met him." "Because I have seen him in my visions during the midnight hours. He is connected to the poison that threatens the inn, and through it, the entire village." Elias stood, his movements fluid despite the weight of his armor. "Tell me, what do you know of the herbs you carry?" Gwyneth looked down at her bouquet. "They are for protection against evil spirits, as my grandmother taught me. Garlic to ward off demons, sage to purify the soul." She paused, her eyes widening. "But last night, I found these same herbs floating in the soup at the inn. I thought it strange, but I did not speak of it." "Someone is using your protective herbs for a darker purpose," Elias said grimly. "They are not warding off evil, they are concealing it." The candle flame flickered, casting dancing shadows across the stone walls. In those shadows, Elias saw glimpses of what was to come, a wedding turned to chaos, blood mingling with broth, and a choice that would determine not just the fate of the village, but the nature of his own existence. "I must ask you something," Gwyneth said, stepping closer. "The other villagers whisper that you are not entirely human. They say you never age, that you have been watching over this place for decades, though you appear to be no older than 30. Is this true?" Elias was quiet for a long moment. What would you do if it were? I would ask why you protect us. What binds you to this place, to these people? Love, he said simply. Love, and a debt that can never be repaid. He moved to the window, gazing out at the darkened village. Long ago, I made a choice that cost an innocent life. I have spent every night since then trying to atone for that mistake. And the armor lined with forbidden velvet, a reminder that some rules are worth breaking, while others carry consequences that echo through eternity. He turned back to her, his eyes reflecting the candlelight like mirrors. Your betrothed is part of something larger, Gwyneth. The poison in the soup, the dreams that plague us both, the shadows that seem to grow longer each night. They are all connected. Then help me stop him, she said, her voice stronger now. Help me break free from this arranged marriage and uncover the truth. Elias studied her face, seeing in it the same determination that had once driven him to make his fateful choice. It will be dangerous. Once we begin this path, there is no turning back. I would rather face danger with you than live a lie with him. Then we begin tomorrow night, during the hours between the first and second sleep. That is when the barriers between worlds are thinnest, when truth can be separated from deception. He picked up his quill again, but this time the words he wrote were his own. But first, we must discover who is poisoning the perpetual soup, and why they want to destroy something that has sustained this community for generations. As Gwyneth prepared to leave, she paused at the door. Elias, if you are truly what the villagers say you are, then what manner of creature is my betrothed? That, he said, returning to his writing, is what we must discover before your wedding day arrives. For I fear that ceremony will be the culmination of a plan that has been years in the making. After she left, Elias continued writing until dawn, his supernatural senses picking up every sound, every scent, every shift in the air around the village. Somewhere out there, an enemy was moving pieces into position for a final game. The perpetual soup was just the beginning. The real target was something far more precious and far more dangerous than anyone could imagine. The bride's desperate gambit. You are now witnessing the morning of what should have been the happiest day in a young woman's life. But in medieval times, happiness was often a luxury that common folk could not afford. The sun rises over a village where tradition and desperation are about to collide in ways that will change everything. Gwyneth Hartwell stood before the cracked mirror in her family's modest home, her wedding dress laid out on the bed like a burial shroud. The garment had been her mother's, and her grandmother's, before that, a simple white linen gown that had witnessed 3 generations of women surrender their dreams to duty. Today you become a woman, her father said from the doorway, his voice carrying none of the joy such an announcement should hold. Thomas Hartwell was a practical man who had arranged this marriage for practical reasons. His daughter's dowry would clear his debts, and her husband's wealth would secure their family's future. Yes, father, Gwyneth replied, though her fingers trembled as she braided protective herbs into her hair. The garlic and sage felt different today, heavier somehow, as if they carried the weight of secrets she had yet to discover. Magnus Thornfield is a good match, Thomas continued, though his eyes would not meet hers. He has land, livestock, and a position at the royal court. You will want for nothing. Except love, Gwyneth whispered, so quietly that her father pretended not to hear. What Thomas did not know was that his daughter had spent the early morning hours preparing for a very different kind of ceremony. Hidden beneath her wedding dress was a small leather pouch containing coins she had saved, a forged letter of safe passage, and a map marking the route to the nearest port city. She had also prepared a second bouquet, this one containing herbs that would induce a convincing illness if consumed in the right quantities. The plan was simple but dangerous. During the wedding feast, she would slip away to the inn where Sir Elias waited with horses and supplies. They would ride hard for the coast, where a ship bound for Ireland could carry them beyond the reach of her father's rage and her betrothed's vengeance. But first, she needed to create enough chaos to cover their escape. Gwyneth called her younger sister, Mary, from below. "Your intended has arrived." Through the window, Gwyneth watched a magnificent procession approach their humble home. Magnus Thornfield rode at the head, his dark hair gleaming in the morning sunlight, his smile revealing teeth that seemed too white, too sharp. Behind him came a dozen armed men, their presence transforming what should have been a celebration into something that felt more like a military occupation. "He is handsome," Mary observed, joining her sister at the window. "You are fortunate, Gwyneth. Most of us will never marry so well." But Gwyneth was not looking at Magnus's face. She was watching his hands. They were pale and smooth, without the calluses that marked a man who worked his own land. More troubling still was the way his men moved, with the practiced precision of soldiers rather than the casual bearing of wedding guests. "Mary," she said quietly, "I need you to deliver a message to Margot at the inn. Tell her that the wedding feast will require an extra portion of her perpetual soup, and that it must be prepared exactly as I instructed yesterday." "What did you instruct yesterday? I thought you were helping with the church decorations." "Just deliver the message," Gwyneth said, pressing a small coin into her sister's palm. "And Mary, ... if anything goes wrong today, if you see me acting strangely, or if the wedding takes an unexpected turn, I want you to run to the inn and stay there until Father comes for you." Mary's eyes widened. "Gwyneth, what are you planning?" "I am planning to save us all," she replied, though she was not entirely certain from what. An hour later, the wedding party gathered outside the church. According to tradition, the ceremony would take place at the church doors, with the congregation witnessing the exchange of vows before entering for the nuptial mass. Gwyneth walked slowly down the aisle, formed by her neighbors and family, her bouquet of herbs clutched tightly in her hands. Magnus awaited her with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. "My beautiful bride," he said, taking her hand. His touch was cold, unnatural, and she had to resist the urge to pull away. "My lord," she replied, maintaining the facade of maidenly submission, while her mind raced through the final details of her escape plan. Father Benedict began the ceremony with a prayer, but his words seemed to fade into background noise as Gwyneth focused on the faces surrounding her. She saw her father's relief, her sister's excitement, and her neighbors' curious stares. But she also saw something else. Several of Magnus's men had positioned themselves strategically around the crowd, their hands resting casually on their sword hilts. "Do you, Gwyneth Hartwell, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Father Benedict asked. This was the moment. She opened her mouth to speak the words that would seal her fate, but instead, she let out a gasp and staggered backward. I feel faint," she whispered, allowing herself to sway convincingly. "The excitement, it is too much. Perhaps some air," Magnus suggested, but his concern seemed forced, theatrical. "No," Gwyneth said, her voice growing stronger. I need the perpetual soup from the inn. My grandmother always said it could cure any ailment." She looked around at the crowd, playing to their superstitions. "Please, just a small bowl to steady my nerves." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the gathering. The perpetual soup was legendary for its restorative properties, and no one would think it strange for a nervous bride to seek its comfort. "Of course, my dear," Magnus said, though something flickered in his expression. "We shall all adjourn to the inn for a pre-wedding meal. The ceremony can wait." As the crowd began to move toward the inn, Gwyneth caught sight of Sir Elias standing at the edge of the churchyard. He gave her an almost imperceptible nod. He was ready. But as they approached the inn, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Smoke was rising from the chimney, but it was the wrong color, too dark, too thick, and the smell that should have been the welcoming aroma of perpetual soup was instead something acrid and bitter. "Elias," she whispered, drawing closer to him in the crowd. "Something is wrong. The soup, ... "I know," he replied quietly. "Margot is dead." The words hit her like a physical blow. "What?" "I found her this morning, collapsed beside the cauldron." The soup has been poisoned. Not with the herbs you suspected, but with something far more dangerous. His eyes met hers, and she saw fear there. Whatever your plan was, Gwyneth, it is no longer viable. We are walking into a trap, then we run. Now, no, Elias said, his voice firm. Too many innocent people will die if we flee. Magnus is not just a cruel husband, he is something much worse. And this wedding, this gathering, is not about claiming you as his bride. It is about claiming the entire village. As they reached the inn's entrance, Magnus called out in a voice that carried unnaturally far. Come, friends. Let us share in the legendary perpetual soup before we celebrate my union with this lovely bride. The door swung open, revealing the interior of the inn. The great cauldron still bubbled over the fire, but the liquid within was now black as pitch. And standing beside it, very much alive but somehow different, was Margot Ashford, her eyes reflecting the flames like mirrors, her smile too wide for her face. Welcome, she said, her voice carrying harmonics that made the wooden beams creak. The soup is ready, and it has been waiting for you all for such a very long time. Gwyneth felt Ilias's hand close around her wrist. Run, he whispered urgently. Now. But before she could move, Magnus's voice rang out behind them, no longer bothering to disguise its inhuman quality. I think not. We have planned this feast for far too long to let anyone leave hungry. The trap was sprung, and Gwyneth realized that her wedding day had become something far more sinister than she had ever imagined. The perpetual soup was no longer just a meal. It had become an instrument of transformation, and everyone in the village was about to discover what they were truly being fed. The servant of shadows, you are now about to witness the most bizarre and intimate of medieval court positions, where proximity to power came through the most unexpected means, and where the person who held the most influence over a king was the one who attended to his most private moments. The chaos at the inn erupted like a pot finally boiling over, as Margot's transformed smile stretched wider than any human mouth should allow. Sir Elias threw himself between the villagers and whatever she had become. His forbidden velvet armor caught the firelight, and for a moment he looked less like a knight and more like an avenging angel. Everyone out, he commanded, his voice carrying an authority that made even Magnus's armed men hesitate. This is no longer a place for the living. But Magnus laughed, a sound like breaking glass mixed with distant thunder. Oh, but Sir Elias, you misunderstand. This is exactly where the living belong, at least for the few moments they have left. In the confusion that followed, Gwyneth found herself pressed against the inn's wall, her wedding dress torn and her protective herbs scattered across the floor. She watched in horror as several villagers, driven by curiosity or hunger, approached the bubbling cauldron despite the warnings. The soup, one of them called out, an elderly farmer named Willem. It smells, ... different, richer, do not touch it. Elias shouted, but his warning came too late. Willem had already dipped his wooden spoon into the black liquid and brought it to his lips. The transformation was immediate and terrible. Willem's eyes rolled back, showing only white, and when he looked up again, his face had taken on the same impossible smile as Margot's. He began to laugh, a sound that sent chills through everyone present. It tastes like memories, Willem said, his voice now carrying the same harmonic distortion as Margot's. Like every soul who ever shared this meal. We are all connected now, all part of the great feast. What have you done? Gwyneth whispered to Magnus, though she feared she already knew the answer. I have given your village the gift of unity, Magnus replied, his handsome facade beginning to crack and reveal something far older and more terrible beneath. For too long, humans have lived separate lives, keeping their secrets, hoarding their knowledge. The perpetual soup will change that. It will make everyone perpetual. That was when another figure emerged from the shadows, someone Gwyneth had never seen before, yet who moved with the confidence of someone who belonged in this place of power and darkness. He was small and slight, dressed in the fine robes of a court official. But there was something in his bearing that suggested he held influence far beyond his appearance. "My Lord Magnus," the newcomer said, with a bow that somehow managed to be both respectful and mocking, "the preparations are complete. The royal court awaits your demonstration." Magnus nodded. "Excellent work, Aldrich. Your position as groom of the stool has served us well. Who would suspect that the king's most trusted confidant, the man who attends to his most intimate needs, would be working to transform the very nature of the realm?" Gwyneth felt sick as the implications became clear. In the English court, the groom of the stool was indeed one of the most influential positions, the person who attended to the king during his most private moments, who had unlimited access to the royal presence, who could whisper suggestions and influence decisions while the monarch was at his most vulnerable. "The irony is delicious," Aldrich continued, his smile every bit as unsettling as the others. "For months, I have been carefully introducing trace amounts of our special preparation into the king's, shall we say, daily routine. His Majesty now craves nothing more than the perpetual soup, and he believes it was his own idea to mandate that every village in the kingdom must maintain such a cauldron." "Brilliant," Magnus said. "And when the transformation is complete, when every soul in England has partaken of the endless feast, they will all be connected, all part of the same eternal consciousness. No more war, no more discord, no more individual will to cause trouble, no more freedom," Elias snarled, raising his sword. "No more choice, no more love, no more anything that makes us human." "Exactly," Magnus agreed cheerfully. "Is it not wonderful?" The battle that followed was like nothing Gwyneth had ever witnessed. Elias moved with inhuman speed and grace, his blades singing through the air as he fought not just Magnus's men, but the transformed villagers who had tasted the corrupted soup. Each strike was precise, aimed not to kill, but to disable, as if he understood that these people might still be saved. But Magnus himself was proving to be no ordinary opponent. When Elias's sword struck him, it passed through his body like he was made of smoke, and he laughed as he reformed on the other side of the room. "You cannot kill what was never truly alive," Magnus taunted. "I am older than your civilization, older than your precious Christianity. I am hunger itself, and I have been feeding on human souls since your ancestors first discovered fire." "Then you have never faced a guardian who has already died," Elias replied, and suddenly his armor began to glow with an inner light. "You see, Magnus, I am not entirely human either. I am what remains when someone gives up their life to protect others, a soul bound to this realm by love and duty." The light from his armor grew brighter, and Gwyneth saw the truth of what he was. Not a living knight, but something far more precious, a spirit who had chosen to remain on earth to guard those who could not guard themselves. "The perpetual soup," Elias called to her over the sounds of battle. "It is not just food, it is a conduit. Every person who has ever eaten from it has left a part of their soul in the pot. That is why it never spoils, why it grows more complex over time. It is literally made of human essence." "But that means," Gwyneth's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "Yes," Elias said, parrying a strike from one of Magnus's men. "If we can purify the soup, we can restore everyone who has been transformed. Their souls are still there, trapped in the perpetual broth. We just need to separate the corruption from the essence." "And how do we do that?" Elias smiled, and for the first time since she had known him, it was a smile of pure joy. "With the one thing that Magnus cannot understand or corrupt, willing sacrifice." Before she could ask what he meant, Elias threw down his sword and walked directly toward the bubbling cauldron. Magnus and his transformed servants moved to stop him, but the light emanating from the knight's armor held them at bay. "You cannot," Magnus screamed. "If you enter the soup while it is corrupted, you will be destroyed completely. Not just your body, but your very soul." "I know," Elias said simply, "but that is exactly what love requires. The willingness to give up everything for others. Gwyneth watched in horror and admiration as the knight she had come to love stepped into the cauldron. The moment his armor touched the black liquid, everything changed. The corruption began to burn away like mist before the sun, and the soup began to clear. More importantly, the transformed villagers began to collapse, their own souls finally free to return to their bodies. But the cost was terrible. As the last of the corruption left the perpetual soup, Elias's light began to fade. His armor cracked and fell away in pieces, and his form became translucent. "Gwyneth," he whispered, his voice growing fainter with each word, "the soup is pure again. The village is safe. But I cannot remain. This was always meant to be my final act." "No," she said, rushing to the cauldron's edge. "There must be another way. You cannot leave us. You cannot leave me." "I am not leaving," he said, smiling as his form began to dissolve. "I am becoming part of something greater. Every time someone eats from this soup, they will taste not just nourishment, but the love that saved them. I will be with you always, in every meal, in every gathering, in every moment when people come together to share what they have." As Elias faded completely, Magnus let out a roar of rage and frustration. Without the corrupted soup to anchor him to this realm, he too began to dissolve, his form breaking apart like smoke in a strong wind. "This is not over," he snarled as he disappeared. "There are other villagers, other soups, other ways to spread the eternal feast. Then we will be ready for you," Gwyneth said, her voice strong despite her tears. "All of us, together." As the chaos settled and the transformed villagers began to recover, Gwyneth looked into the cauldron. The perpetual soup bubbled gently, its rich aroma filling the inn with warmth and comfort. But now she could see it for what it truly was, not just a meal, but a communion. A way for people to share not just food, but the very essence of what made them human. The wedding dress she wore was ruined, but somehow that felt appropriate. She had not become the bride she was meant to be. She had become something far more important. She had become a guardian of the tradition that would keep her people safe and connected for generations to come. The pursuit of impossible beauty. You are now entering the most vain and dangerous aspects of medieval court culture, where the pursuit of beauty could literally cost a woman her life, and where the difference between divine perfection and demonic corruption was thinner than a plucked eyebrow. 3 weeks had passed since the incident at the inn, and life in the village was slowly returning to normal. The perpetual soup bubbled peacefully in its cauldron, tended now by a rotation of volunteers who had sworn to protect it from future corruption. Gwyneth had taken over much of the coordination, her near marriage to Magnus having given her an unexpected authority in village affairs. But not everyone had recovered from the supernatural attack. Some villagers still suffered from strange dreams. Others reported seeing shadows where none should be, and a few had developed an obsessive fascination with their own reflections. It was this last symptom that brought Gwyneth to the door of Rosalind Fairfax's cottage on a grey October morning. Rosalind had been one of the most beautiful women in the village, known for her perfect features and her skill with herbs and remedies. But since the incident at the inn, she had become something else entirely. "Rosalind," Gwyneth called through the wooden door. "It is Gwyneth. I have come to check on you." The door opened to reveal a shocking sight. Rosalind stood before her, but she was barely recognizable. Her once lustrous hair had been plucked away from her forehead, creating a bizarrely high hairline that made her look like a living painting. Her eyebrows and eyelashes had been completely removed, leaving her face eerily smooth and artificial. "Gwyneth," Rosalind said, her voice breathless with excitement, "look at me. Am I not beautiful? Am I not perfect?" "Rosalind, what have you done to yourself?" "I have achieved the ideal," Rosalind replied, turning to show her profile. The court ladies in London pluck their hairlines to create the perfect oval face. They remove all unsightly hair to better display the forehead, which is the seat of intelligence and beauty. I have simply perfected the technique. Gwyneth stepped inside the cottage and gasped. Every surface was covered with mirrors, polished metal, pieces of broken glass. even bowls of water positioned to catch and reflect light. Rosalind had turned her home into a hall of mirrors, and in each reflection she appeared slightly different, as if the mirrors themselves were showing her various possibilities of beauty. This is not natural beauty, Rosalind. This is ... Gwyneth searched for the right word. This is obsession. Is it obsession to strive for perfection? Rosalind asked, moving to stand before the largest mirror. In the court, they say that a woman's beauty is her greatest weapon, her most valuable possession. I am simply sharpening my blade. But as Gwyneth looked closer, she realized that Rosalind's transformation went beyond mere vanity. The skin where her hair had been removed was raw and infected, suggesting that she had been pulling it out by the roots rather than carefully shaving it. Her eyes, without their protective lashes, were red and irritated. Most disturbing of all, she seemed to be growing thinner, as if her obsession with external beauty was consuming her from within. When did you last eat? Gwyneth asked. Eat? Rosalind laughed, a sound like breaking bells. Food is for peasants. I sustain myself on beauty alone. Each morning, I drink only rose water and honey. Each evening, I apply crushed pearls to my skin to make it glow like moonlight. Rosalind, you are making yourself ill. This is not beauty. This is madness. Madness. Rosalind's reflections seemed to flicker in the mirrors. Or perhaps I am simply seeing truth that others cannot. Come, look into the mirror with me. See yourself as you truly are. Despite her better judgment, Gwyneth approached the large mirror. What she saw there made her blood freeze. Her reflection looked normal, but Rosalind's reflection was perfect. Not just beautiful, but impossibly, inhumanly perfect. Her skin was flawless porcelain, her features mathematically precise, her eyes like jewels. She looked like a saint in a church painting, too perfect to be real. Do you see? Rosalind whispered. This is who I truly am. This is who I was meant to be. That is not you, Gwyneth said firmly. That is something else wearing your face. As if responding to her words, the reflection smiled, but Rosalind's actual face did not move. The thing in the mirror was acting independently, and it was looking directly at Gwyneth with an expression of predatory interest. You could be beautiful too, the reflection said, its voice coming from everywhere and nowhere. You have good bone structure, adequate features, with the right ... modifications. You could be perfection itself. I am beautiful as I am, Gwyneth replied, but her voice lacked conviction. Looking at Rosalind's impossible reflection, she could not help but notice her own flaws, the slight asymmetry of her features, the imperfections in her skin, the way her hair fell unevenly around her face. Are you, the reflection asked, or are you simply accepting mediocrity because you lack the courage to pursue true beauty? Do not listen to it, came a familiar voice from the doorway. Gwyneth turned to see a translucent figure that might have been Sir Elias, though he was fainter than morning mist. It is not beauty that thing offers, but enslavement. Elias, Gwyneth's heart leaped. You are still here. Part of me remains, he said, his form flickering like candlelight. I am bound to this place by love and duty, and both tell me that you are in danger. The corruption that Magnus brought to the village was not entirely cleansed. Some of it has taken root in those who are most vulnerable to temptation. I am not vulnerable, Rosalind said, but her voice was uncertain. I am pursuing perfection. Perfection is a trap, Elias replied. True beauty comes from life, from flaws, from the marks that experience leaves on our souls. What you see in that mirror is not perfection. It is death, wearing a pretty mask. As if to prove his point, Rosalind's reflection began to change. The perfect features started to crack like old paint, revealing something dark and hungry beneath. The thing in the mirror was not offering beauty, it was consuming it, feeding on Rosalind's vanity and self-doubt, until nothing remained but an empty shell. I can still save her, Gwyneth said, stepping toward the mirror. If I can break the connection between her and that thing... No, Elias said urgently. If you touch the mirror while it is corrupted, You will be pulled into its realm. You will become another reflection, another pretty face feeding its hunger. Then what do? We remind her of who she truly is, Elias said. Not the impossible beauty she sees in the mirror, but the real woman who helped deliver babies, who nursed the sick, who made people laugh with her wit and warmth. Gwyneth understood. She moved to stand beside Rosalind, careful not to look directly into the mirror. Do you remember, she said softly, when little Thomas had the fever last spring? You sat with him for 3 days, bathing his forehead, singing him songs, refusing to leave his side until the fever broke. Rosalind's voice wavered. I was not beautiful then. I was exhausted, unwashed. You were beautiful, Gwyneth insisted. You were the most beautiful thing in the world. A woman using her strength to save a child. That is real beauty, Rosalind. That is the beauty that matters. But the mirrors, Rosalind said, her voice growing stronger. They show me what I could be. They show you what you could lose. Gwyneth corrected. Look at yourself. Truly look. You are disappearing, becoming nothing but an image. Is that perfection, or is that death? For the first time in weeks, Rosalind looked away from the mirrors and truly saw herself. She saw the infected scalp, the irritated eyes, the way her clothes hung loose on her shrinking frame. She saw what her pursuit of impossible beauty had cost her. I am dying, she whispered. But you are not dead yet, Elias said, his form growing slightly more solid. You can still choose life over perfection, reality over reflection. Rosalind looked around at the mirrors that filled her cottage. What must I do? Break them, Gwyneth said. All of them. Choose to see yourself through the eyes of those who love you, not through the hungry gaze of something that wants to consume you. It took considerable courage, but Rosalind picked up a wooden stool and brought it crashing down on the largest mirror. The glass shattered, and with it, something else seemed to break. A spell, a hold, a connection to the realm of impossible things. One by one, they destroyed every mirror in the cottage. With each shattering, Rosalind seemed to grow more solid, more real, more herself. Her hair began to grow back, her eyes lost their fevered gleam, and color returned to her cheeks. I am not perfect, she said when the last mirror was broken, but I am alive, and alive is always more beautiful than perfect, Gwyneth replied. As they cleaned up the broken glass, Elias's spirit began to fade again. The village is safer now, he said, but there are still threats. Magnus spoke truly when he said this was not over. There are other forms of corruption, other ways that the ancient hungers can take hold. Then we will face them, Gwyneth said. Together, yes, Rosalind agreed, touching her growing hair. Together, because true beauty is not something we achieve alone. It is something we create through our connections with others. As autumn deepened into winter, the village learned to recognize the signs of supernatural corruption. They learned to value the imperfect, the real, the beautifully flawed. And they learned that sometimes the most dangerous enemies are the ones that promise to give us exactly what we think we want. The outlaw's impossible choice. You are now experiencing the harsh reality of medieval justice, where a single decision could strip away every protection society offered, leaving you to survive in a world where you were literally outside the law, and where mercy and justice often wore the same face. Winter had settled over the village like a grey shroud, and with it came news that chilled the blood more than any frost. King Edward's men were riding through the countryside, hunting for outlaws and imposing new taxes that would push many families to the edge of starvation. Among those they sought was a man the villagers knew only as the blacksmith of Sherwood, though his real name was Gareth Ironright, and his story was far more complex than the legend suggested. Gwyneth first encountered him on a bitter December morning when she was gathering firewood near the forest edge. She heard the ring of hammer on anvil echoing through the trees, which was strange because there was no smithy in the deep woods. Following the sound, she discovered a clearing where a makeshift forge had been built from stone and clay, and there, working with the focused intensity of a man who had nothing left to lose, was the most wanted outlaw in 3 counties. "You should not be here," Gareth said, without looking up from his work. He was crafting horseshoes, but these were not ordinary shoes. They were marked with symbols that seemed to shift and dance in the firelight. "Neither should you," Gwyneth replied. "The king's men passed through the village yesterday. They are offering a reward for your capture." "Let them come," Gareth said, finally raising his head. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 30 years old, with the broad shoulders and calloused hands of a working man. But his eyes held a weight that spoke of terrible choices and their consequences. "I have work to finish." "What kind of work requires an outlaw's forge in the middle of winter?" Gareth set down his hammer and gestured to the items surrounding his workspace. There were horseshoes, yes, but also farming tools, kitchen knives, and children's toys, all marked with the same shifting symbols. "I make things that cannot be made in the king's realm, things that exist outside the law." "What does that mean?" "It means," said a weak voice from the shadows, "that he is trying to save us all." Gwyneth spun around to see a figure emerging from behind the trees. It was a young man, perhaps 16 years old, but he was dressed in rich clothes, and his face bore the unmistakable features of nobility. More shocking still, he was clearly injured, blood soaked through his fine tunic, and he moved with the careful steps of someone trying not to aggravate a serious wound. "Prince Edmund," Gareth said, his voice heavy with resignation. "I told you to stay hidden." "I am tired of hiding," the prince replied, leaning heavily against a tree. "And I am tired of pretending that what my father is doing is just." Gwyneth looked between the outlaw and the prince, trying to understand. "What is happening here?" "Tell her," Edmund said to Gareth. "Tell her why you became an outlaw, and why I am here despite my father's orders." Gareth was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the fire. "I was the royal blacksmith," he said finally. "I served King Edward faithfully for 15 years, crafting weapons and armor for his armies. But then he ordered me to create something ... else. Something that no decent person should ever make." "Weapons of enslavement," Edmund added, his young voice bitter with knowledge. "Chains that could bind not just the body, but the soul itself. Collars that would make a person incapable of disobedience, of independent thought. My father intended to use them on his enemies, but I knew it would not stop there. Once such things exist, they spread like poison." "I refused," Gareth continued. "I told the king that I would not forge chains for men's souls. He gave me a choice: create the enslavement devices, or be declared an outlaw and lose everything I had ever owned or loved." "And you chose outlawry," Gwyneth said. "I chose to remain human," Gareth corrected. "But the king was not finished with me. He sent soldiers to my village, to my family. He said that if I would not serve him willingly, I would serve him through grief." "They killed everyone," Edmund said quietly. "Gareth's wife, his children, his parents, everyone who might have given him a reason to refuse the king's demands. But it did not work as the king intended," Gareth said, his voice growing stronger. "Instead of breaking me, it freed me. I had nothing left to lose, nothing left to protect, except the principle that had driven me to refuse in the first place. So I fled to the forest, and I began to work. Work on what? On weapons that fight enslavement instead of enabling it," Gareth said, holding up one of the marked horseshoes. "These symbols are not decorative, they are protective. Any horse that wears these shoes cannot be used to carry a rider on an unjust mission. Any tool I mark with these symbols will break rather than be used to harm an innocent person. And that is why my father's men hunt him so desperately," Edmund added. "Not because he is a common criminal, but because he is creating things that make tyranny impossible." "But why are you here?" Gwyneth asked the prince. "Why are you helping him?" Edmund's laugh was bitter. "Because I discovered that my father intends to use me as his final weapon against Gareth. He has learned where the outlaw's forge is hidden, and he plans to attack it with a full army. But first, he wants to offer Gareth a choice, surrender, and create the enslavement devices, or watch the king's own son die. He injured you deliberately, Gwyneth realized with horror. He had me beaten and thrown from my horse near the forest edge, Edmund confirmed. He knew that Gareth would find me, and he knew that Gareth's conscience would not allow him to let me die. The plan was simple. I would recover just enough to deliver my father's ultimatum, and then Gareth would have to choose between his principles and an innocent life. Except, Gareth said, you are not as innocent as your father believes. You came here not to deliver his message, but to warn me. I came here to stop him, Edmund said firmly. My father has become something monstrous, and I will not allow him to spread that monstrosity to others, even if it costs me my life. It may cost you more than that, Gareth said gravely. If you help me, you will become an outlaw too. You will lose your title, your inheritance, your very identity. Everything you have ever known will be stripped away. Then I will be free to become who I was meant to be, Edmund replied, instead of who I was born to be. The three of them stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the decision hanging heavy in the winter air. Finally, Gwyneth spoke. What do you need us to do? Both men looked at her in surprise. Us, Gareth asked. Did you think I would walk away from this? Did you think I would return to my village and pretend I had never seen what I have seen? Gwyneth shook her head. I have already faced supernatural evil. I have already lost the man I loved to a fight that was larger than any individual. I will not turn away from this battle simply because it is against earthly rather than otherworldly corruption. The king's army will be here by dawn, Edmund said. We have perhaps 6 hours to prepare. Then we had better work quickly, Gareth replied. But I warn you both, what we are about to attempt has never been tried before. We are going to forge weapons that fight not just against the body, but against tyranny itself. The process is dangerous, and the outcome is uncertain. Uncertain is better than surrender, Gwyneth said. Uncertain is better than enslavement, Edmund agreed. As they worked through the night, crafting weapons and armor marked with symbols that seemed to glow with their own inner light, Gwyneth found herself thinking about the nature of justice. In her village, she had learned that laws were meant to protect people, not control them. She had learned that true authority came from service, not domination. And she had learned that sometimes the greatest act of loyalty was disobedience. When the king's army arrived at dawn, they found the clearing empty except for a cold forge and a message burned into the trunk of an ancient oak tree. The chains you make for others will be the chains that bind you. But Gareth, Edmund, and Gwyneth were not gone. They were simply no longer confined by the boundaries that had once defined them. They had become something new, something that existed in the spaces between the world of law and the world of justice. They had become the guardians of freedom itself, protectors of the principle that no person should have the power to own another's soul. The king's men searched the forest for days, but they could not find what they were looking for. How do you capture someone who has become larger than their individual existence? How do you chain someone who has learned to live in the realm of principles rather than possessions? The answer, of course, was that you could not. And in the weeks that followed, as tools and weapons marked with Gareth's symbols began to appear in villages throughout the kingdom, King Edward began to understand that he had created something far more dangerous than any single outlaw. He had created an idea, and ideas, once released into the world, could never be made captive again. Epilogue: The Eternal Feast. You have journeyed through the bizarre customs of the Middle Ages, witnessed the supernatural forces that shaped daily life, and discovered that the most powerful traditions are those that connect us to something larger than ourselves. Now, as our tale draws to a close, you must understand that some stories never truly end. They simply transform, becoming part of the eternal feast that nourishes the human spirit across all ages. 5 years had passed since the winter when 3 unlikely allies had defied a king and disappeared into legend. The village had prospered in ways that defied explanation. Crops grew more abundantly, children were born healthier, and the elderly lived longer than anyone had expected. Most importantly, the perpetual soup continued to bubble in its eternal cauldron, tended by a community that had learned to recognize the difference between nourishment and consumption. Gwyneth stood in the doorway of what had once been Margot's inn, now transformed into something that served multiple purposes. It was still an inn, welcoming travelers with warm meals and safe beds, but it was also a school where children learned not just letters and numbers, but the deeper lessons of community and connection. It was a meeting hall where disputes were settled and celebrations shared, and it was a sanctuary where those who had lost their way could find refuge and renewal. "Tell us the story again," requested young Mary, not Gwyneth's sister, but the daughter of Willem, the farmer who had been among the first to taste the corrupted soup, and among the first to be saved. The child was perhaps 8 years old, with bright eyes and an insatiable curiosity about the events that had shaped her world. "Which story?" Gwyneth asked, though she knew the answer. The children always wanted to hear the same tale, the story of the knight who gave his life to save a village, the bride who chose freedom over security, and the outlaw who taught them that justice was more important than law. "The story of the soup," Mary said, settling cross-legged on the floor with a dozen other children. "The story of how it became magic." "The soup was always magic," Gwyneth corrected gently. "We simply learned to see it." She ladled herself a bowl from the great cauldron, breathing in the rich aroma that seemed to carry the essence of countless meals, countless gatherings, countless acts of sharing. "Magic is not something that happens to us. It is something we create together." "But what about Sir Elias?" asked Thomas, Willem's son. "Is he really in the soup?" Gwyneth smiled, remembering the translucent figure she sometimes glimpsed in the steam rising from the cauldron. "He is wherever love is remembered," she said. "Whenever someone shares what they have with someone who needs it. Whenever someone chooses to help rather than harm. Whenever someone decides that the good of all is more important than the comfort of one. That is where Sir Elias lives." "And the prince and the blacksmith?" Mary pressed. "Did they really defeat the evil king?" "They did something more important than defeat him," Gwyneth replied. "They reminded people that authority comes from service, not from power. That true wealth is not what you can take, but what you can give. That the only chains that cannot be broken are the ones we forge for ourselves." It was true. King Edward's reign had ended, not in battle, but in transformation. The marked tools and weapons that Gareth had created had spread throughout the kingdom, and with them, the idea that freedom was not something that could be granted or taken away, but something that existed in the very act of choosing to live with dignity and purpose. "Will you stay with us always?" Thomas asked. "Will you keep telling the stories?" "I will stay as long as I am needed," Gwyneth said. "But someday, you will be the ones telling the stories. You will be the ones keeping the soup cooking, the ones welcoming strangers, the ones remembering that every person who enters this place carries part of the great tale within them." As the children drifted away to their various homes and duties, Gwyneth found herself alone with the perpetual soup. She stirred it slowly, thoughtfully, adding a handful of herbs and a measure of fresh vegetables. The soup would continue long after she was gone, just as it had continued long before she was born. But now it carried something extra, the knowledge that even the most ordinary things could become extraordinary when they were shared with love. The door opened, and a figure entered, a traveling merchant by his clothes, dusty from the road and weary from whatever journey had brought him to this place. "Welcome," Gwyneth said, as Margot had said to countless travelers before her. "You look like you could use a meal and a warm place to rest." "I could indeed," the merchant replied, settling gratefully onto a bench. "I have traveled far, and I confess I am not entirely certain of my destination." "Then perhaps you are exactly where you need to be," Gwyneth said, ladling him a bowl of the perpetual soup. "This is a place where stories are shared, where burdens are lightened, and where no one remains a stranger for long." The merchant accepted the bowl with trembling hands, And when he tasted the soup, his eyes widened with surprise. This is ... remarkable. I have never tasted anything like it. It is the product of time and community, Gwyneth explained. Every person who has ever shared this meal has left something of themselves in the pot. Every story told over this soup, every friendship formed, every act of kindness witnessed, it all becomes part of the flavor. The merchant nodded slowly, understanding more than his words revealed. I am seeking something, he said carefully, something that was lost long ago. I have been told that in places like this, where old traditions are maintained, such things might be found. What have you lost? Gwyneth asked, settling beside him with her own bowl. My son, the merchant said simply. He was taken from me 5 years ago, during the troubles with King Edward. He was conscripted into the royal army, forced to march against people who were fighting for their freedom. I have not seen him since. Gwyneth's heart clenched with recognition. What was his name? Edmund, the merchant said. Prince Edmund, though I suppose he is no prince now. I am his true father, not King Edward, but the man who raised him before the king claimed him as his heir. The king stole my boy and tried to make him into something he was never meant to be. The revelation hung in the air like incense, heavy with possibility and sorrow. Gwyneth had always wondered about Prince Edmund's true origins, about the kindness and conscience that had seemed so at odds with his supposed royal blood. Your son, she said slowly, is alive. More than alive, he is free. And if you are willing to listen, I can tell you a story about a young man who chose justice over birthright, who gave up a crown to gain his soul. As the evening deepened, Gwyneth told the merchant about his son's courage, about the choice Edmund had made to stand with an outlaw blacksmith against tyranny itself. She told him about the weapons that fought enslavement, about the symbols that protected the innocent, about the idea that had spread across the kingdom like wildfire. He is not the prince he was raised to be, she concluded, but he has become the man you taught him to be in his earliest years, someone who values people over power, truth over comfort, love over law. The merchant wept then, tears of grief and joy mingling on his weathered cheeks. Can I see him? He asked. Can I tell him that I never stopped looking, never stopped hoping? He will come, Gwyneth said with certainty. The perpetual soup calls to those who belong here. It will bring him home when the time is right. And indeed, 3 days later, 2 figures appeared on the road approaching the inn. One was tall and broad-shouldered, his hands marked by years of working with fire and metal. The other was younger, leaner, but carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned to find strength in service rather than authority. The reunion that followed was more beautiful than any royal ceremony, more meaningful than any crown. A father embraced the son he had thought lost forever, while the community that had become their family watched with tears of joy. I have something for you, Gareth said to Gwyneth later that evening, as the celebration continued around them. He handed her a small object, a silver spoon marked with the same protective symbols that had adorned his weapons and tools. What is it for? She asked. For the soup, he said, a spoon that will ensure the perpetual pot never loses its power to nourish, to heal, to bring people together. As long as this spoon stirs the broth, the soup will remain true to its purpose. And what purpose is that? Gwyneth asked, though she thought she knew the answer. To remind us, Edmund said, joining the conversation, that the most powerful magic in the world is the simple act of sharing what we have with those who need it. To show us that tradition is not about preserving the past, but about carrying the best of human nature into the future. As the years passed, the inn became famous throughout the land. Travelers would journey for weeks to taste the perpetual soup and hear the stories of the people who had learned to see magic in the everyday world. They came seeking adventure and left understanding that the greatest adventures were the ones that transformed not just individuals, but entire communities. The soup continued to bubble, tended by generations of villagers who understood that their most important duty was not to themselves, but to the tradition they carried forward. Children grew up knowing that they were part of something larger than their individual lives, something that connected them to everyone who had come before and everyone who would come after. And sometimes, late at night, when the inn was quiet and the fire burned low, those who looked closely into the steam rising from the perpetual pot might see the ghostly figure of a knight in velvet-lined armor, stirring the soup with gentle hands and smiling at the knowledge that love, once given freely, never truly dies. The bizarre customs of the Middle Ages had taught them the most important lesson of all, that the strangest traditions are often the ones that reveal the deepest truths about human nature, that in sharing food, stories, and dreams, people create something more lasting than any castle, more valuable than any treasure, more powerful than any weapon. They create community. They create meaning. They create magic. And in a world where such things are always under threat, that may be the most important work of all.